can let Erica take it away.
Awesome. All right. Well, I'm going to share my screen. Here we go. Whoops.
There we go.
Okay. So you should see a screen that says Distinctive Women, the notable, eccentric, unpopular, misunderstood, and unapologetically quirky women of Issaquah. And if that's correct, then I'm in the right place.
Erica, it says the power of individual stories.
Okay. Oh, yeah, I just hit that. It's telling me my screen sharing is paused. But if you see the power of individual stories, then we're okay.
Yep.
All right. So, backing up just a touch. So my name is Erica Manias. I'm the director of the Issaquah History Museums. I've been in that role for almost 21 years. And one of my favorite things to do is to go out into the community and talk to folks about Issaquah's history. So doing this in a virtual way is a little bit new for me. So I'm trying to remember that you are a group of faces that make up people, and not just the screen that I'm looking at. So I'm looking forward to hearing your questions and things, because that'll also make you a little more real to me. So as far as making people real to you, that's one of the reasons that I really enjoy doing research and talking about individual stories of individual people who've lived in Issaquah. So one of the reasons that I think that's important is because history is never really only local. If you think about your own life, chances are good that you don't have boundary fences around different parts of your life. You've moved from place to place. Maybe you've lived in different regions. I've lived in 3 different regions in my life. So if you were going to follow my life story along, you would have to travel a little bit. You wouldn't be able to stay in just one place. And that's true of a lot of the people who came through Issaquah. They didn't necessarily start in Issaquah, and they may not have finished in Issaquah, but they played a role in the story at some point in between. So history benefits from reexamination. We're talking about that a lot right now because of all of the kind of civil unrest that we're going through. And we're talking about how there are different ways of looking at our history and different lenses of looking at them. So I think it's great if we can periodically go back to that old story that we heard 20 years ago and ask ourselves, has my lens changed? Has the world's lens changed? How might this story be different based on what I know today? So the story of one town like Issaquah is made up of the story of many people. I'm a strong believer in the humanities, the idea of individual stories and individual people making up a whole. And finally, the power of individual stories gives us a depth of understanding that's not possible when we just look at the surface. So each of the stories that I'm going to tell you about individual women who've been part of Issaquah's past, most of the research that I've done into each of them started with some piece of the story coming across my desk and my saying, there's really got to be more to this than what I'm seeing. This sounds interesting, and I want to dive into that and find out a little bit more about it. So we're going to talk about a handful of different women and share a little bit of their individual stories. So the first woman, so I just want to check and make sure that the screen says A.Z. Hopkins, and then I'll stop fretting about the screen moving forward, because it is still telling me that I'm my screen sharing is paused.
Yeah, it says it still says the power of individual stories.
All right, so let me figure out why this is happening. Okay.
There we are.
All right.
Perfect.
Phew, okay. So we start our story with A.Z. Hopkins, and what you're looking at is an entry from the 1900 census in Issaquah. And so I just happened to be looking through the census like one does, and I noticed, well, John Osborne is living there in the depot with his family, and living with them is a boarder named A.Z. Hopkins. And I noticed that it was a woman, and I thought, well, that's interesting, a woman going by her initials. And then I noticed that she was listed as a telegraph operator. So that led me down a little rabbit hole where I learned that Before nursing and school teaching, one of the important jobs that was available to women was a telegraph operator. In the 1920s, the Girl Scouts actually offered a badge in Morse code as sort of a signal that this is where some of the ideas about what women should get educated about was headed in that direction. The idea that telegrapher was a good position. So did men telegraphers accept women telegraphers? Not really. There were a lot of women who used their initials when they were sending code because they didn't like to broadcast that they were women. And a lot of the men telegraphers said that they could just tell when it was a woman on the other end of the line by the way that they coded. So I doubt that, but that is one of the reasons that women went by their initials. We also had another station agent in Issaquah who was married, and his wife also had the same training that he had. And so she would interchangeably use her initials in place of his back and forth. And so they kind of coexisted as one station agent. But anyway, women telegraphers were not paid what men telegraphers were, and they were not universally accepted, but there was one here living in Issaquah. So then I wondered, well, what happened to her? Because she didn't stay in Issaquah. I couldn't find an A.Z. Hopkins in 1910. So where'd she go? Well, I tracked her down. I found an Audrey Hopkins in the 1910 census living in Ketchikan, Alaska, and working as a postmistress. So being a telegrapher and being a postmistress would have some transferable skills. A post office is a good, sensible place to have a telegraph office. So I got in touch with the Ketchikan Historical Society, and they were able to provide me with this picture. And we find out that her name is Audrey Zilpa, A-Z. She goes by Zilpa most often, and she is circled in the picture above. And this is the 1904 Ketchikan women's basketball team. Of which she was a member. So, and the folks up in Ketchikan were also able to find a note out of the Mining Journal of Ketchikan, Alaska. There's a note in 1901 that the daughter of Dr. M.M. Hopkins, Zilpa, is expected to arrive in Ketchikan from Bothell, Washington. So this helps us figure out the ties in Audrey Zilpa's story a little bit. So she worked as a telegrapher in Issaquah for a while. Then she moved to Bothell. That was not unusual for telegraphers. They could get moved around a lot within the railroad. And then she decided to move to Alaska and live with her parents. And she became first the assistant to the postmaster, and then she became the postmistress, and then she was appointed as the head of office. And then she married a man named E.E. Blackmar, who also worked at the post office. And they were happily married for about 33 years until he passed away. And then she and her sister moved to Snoqualmie together, so they came back to the area. So that is the story of Audrey Zilpa Hopkins, and that gives you kind of a peek into the world of what it was like to be a telegrapher. And of course, certainly for her, living as a boarder and traveling by herself to Alaska, working up there, I'm sure that was a huge adventure for a woman in her time and space. So now we're going to move on to Bessie Wilson Crane. So Bessie Wilson Crane is sort of Issaquah's answer to Laura Ingalls Wilder. She was born in 1882 in Missouri, and her family moved to what was then called Squak Valley in about 1887. And when I say her family, I mean her grandparents, aunts, uncles, parents, a whole bunch of people moved out. The Wilsons were a pretty large family, and they would go on to marry into the Pickering and Tibbetts family, which are two names you hear a lot. You don't hear the Wilson name a lot because none of the male line stayed here, and a lot of the girls in the family moved away. So, but there's a picture of her outside the schoolhouse in Squak Valley as a small girl. This is her when she's older, after she has married. So she wrote a memoir about her time growing up in Squak Valley. And there are some great stories in there about her misbehaving and shirking her chores, and stories about her favorite dog and her horse. and the friends that she made in, in Squaw Valley. We also have kind of re-released the book with an opening that talks about some of the racist stereotypes that she also perpetuates in her story. So, so it is fun to read, but it does require a few footnotes when it comes to talking about Chinese laborers and Native Americans. So she went on to marry a showman. She married a guy who put on chautauquas around the country. And she's sitting on a stump outside the roadhouse that they operated down in Auburn. Unfortunately, he was not a great husband. He wasn't good with money, and he was not good with alcohol. And so eventually they separated, and she moved back into the area to live the rest of her life. But you can tell here she is in the early 1900s. She's wearing pants, she's got a cigar, she's got a pistol on her hip and a hat on her knee, and she looks like the kind of person it would be really fun to go to coffee with. So that's a little bit about Bessie Wilson Crane. Speaking of going to coffee with fun people, this brings us to Mary and Sana Wold, who are some of my favorite Issaquahns. So if you're familiar with Gilman Village, the building over there that now forms, I believe it's called the Farmhouse Cooperative School, that building was built in 1908, and it was the second home of the Wold family here in Issaquah. So their father, the father of the children you're looking at in this picture, he operated a hops farm, and these 4 kids were named Mary was the oldest girl, Sana was her younger sister, the fellow who's seated was Andrew, and then Lud is the little boy who's standing. And Andrew and Lud grew up and got married and had careers and did other interesting things, but frankly I find Mary and Sana to be a little more interesting. And we'll talk about why that is. So the Wold family is one of the best documented families in Issaquah, and that's because Andrew Wold played a role in helping to found the Historical Society in the 70s, and a lot of their original materials ended up in part of our collection. So both of these pictures are great, and both of the things written on the pictures help us understand a little bit more about the family. So on your left, we have Lars Wold, and Sana Wold is in the foreground, and in between the two of them is a young woman who's probably a teacher who boarded with them. They almost always had a teacher living with them at some point in time. They were both trained as teachers, and so they had a lot of sympathy and affection for teachers. So on the back of this picture is written, "Not Maud Muller on a Summer's Day." And somebody pointed out to me that that's actually, Maud Muller is a poem by John Greenleaf Whittier about a young woman who goes out on a summer's day and meets someone and falls in love. So I thought that was an interesting little poetry note on the back of that picture, and that tells us a little bit about Sana Wold as far as enjoying writing transcriptions from poetry on the backs of pictures. So the other picture is a picture of 5 young women sitting on the steps of the Wold house. The woman at far left is Sana Wold. I'm not sure about the others. I suspect that Mary Wold took the picture. So I believe this to be an early meeting of what was called the Odd Old Maids Club. So the Odd Old Maids Club was a group that was founded by Mary Wold and one of her friends, a woman named Bessie Marsh. And they mentioned them in the Issaquah Press more than once, and you could tell that the editor of the press was really confused about what exactly this club was about. It had Old Maid in it, so it must have had something to do with catching a husband as far as the editor was concerned, and that was not the case. So the newspaper describes these 2 get-togethers of the Odd Old Maids Club. On one occasion, they all got up at the crack of dawn, put on men's clothing, as we see in the picture, and went fishing together, and reportedly did very well. And then another coverage of a get-together was that they all got together dressed up as nursery rhyme characters, a la Little Miss Muffet, etc., and had a tea party together. So I don't think that it had anything to do with catching a husband. I think that it was a group of women with a good sense of humor and a good idea of how to have fun together. And I would have loved to go to an Odd Old Maids Club meeting. So, so that's the skinny. That's what I know so far on the Odd Old Maids Club. And if I ever find out anything else, I will definitely share it with you because I think they sound delightful. So the Wold girls were really active in the community. Neither of them married, which I probably mentioned. They were very fond of animals. They were educated and comfortable in the city. We see a lot of postcards from the city to their friends talking about shows that they're seeing or shopping that they're doing or things that they're visiting when they're there in Seattle. But they were also definitely really comfortable on the farm. And there are other entries in their scrapbook albums where it shows pictures of groups of people who've come out from school in Seattle to spend the weekend in Issaquah to help with the haying, to see what the country's like. And so there was this concerted effort to kind of introduce some of these city people to what life was like out in Issaquah. So they seem to have been very social and outgoing and had a great sense of humor. So, and these are two pictures from their album. Up top is a picture of them playing some sort of a card game that seems to involve, and guessing what card somebody has on their hat brim or up in their hairdo. The lower is a picture of a group of people out hiking on a snow-topped mountain. There were tons of these skiing, hiking, outdoorsy pictures as well among their photos. So Mary Wold, we'll take a quick look at here. This isn't a great picture. We've zoomed in on it. So Mary grew up and attended Ellensburg Normal School. A normal school was a school for training teachers. So she became trained as a teacher and she taught in local Issaquah schools for a while. And then she decided that she wasn't done getting an education and she went back and she learned to be a nurse. So she got her nursing degree. And this picture is taken when she went during World War I to Siberia to work for the Red Cross. So this is incredibly significant, the fact that a girl from Issaquah would end up in Siberia during World War I, because this was still at a time period where if you took the train from Issaquah to Seattle for a shopping trip, that got put in the paper. So the idea of her traveling all the way to Siberia is sort of mind-blowing. After that adventure, she came home and she was the director of school nursing for the Seattle School District for a while. And then she later worked in Furlam's tuberculosis sanitarium. She lived out her retirement in Issaquah and died in 1961. Her sister, Sana, and you can always tell Sana in the pictures because she has her chin tucked down like that. That's how I figured out how to catalog her. She also always has a very tiny little waist in all of her pictures. So Sana also went to Ellensburg and attended school and was trained as a teacher, but determined that teaching was not for her. And instead she became a clerk and a bookkeeper at the Standard Oil Company in Issaquah. But that was not all she did. In 1921, she founded her own poultry company. And by 1930, that poultry company was valued at about $4,000. So she probably would not have been able to do that had she not had some income from her family. But it's still a remarkable thing that a woman of her age without direct parental support was doing something that amazing. So in 1928, she traveled to London to attend the World Poultry Congress. Again, this is a pretty significant trip for somebody in that day and age. And if you are interested in seeing her name tag from that event, we actually have it on display over at the museum. Sana's photo albums are full of pictures of animals, cats, birds, horses, chickens. She loved her chickens. And in her later life, she trained German Shepherds. There are a lot of challenges in telling Mary from Sana in pictures when you're cataloging them. I did a ton of cataloging of photos of these two women, and I had a very happy moment one day when I came across a postcard that Mary had sent her aunt that had a picture of the girls on the front, and Mary wrote on the back, "People really have a hard time telling Sana and I apart these days. We get more and more alike as we get older." And I thought, oh my gosh, thank goodness it's not just me, because I really have a hard time telling the two apart. But so moving on to Stella Mae Alexander. I actually did a podcast taping of, about Stella a few weeks ago for the, actually maybe a month ago or so, for the city of Issaquah, and that's worth checking out if this piques your interest. So Stella was born in Pennsylvania. She had a relatively unhappy childhood. Her parents divorced when she was young, and she and her siblings were sort of spread out among foster homes and orphanages. She was adopted by someone when she was about 14 and relocated to California. By 1900, she was living there by herself. She was about 18 and she was working as a waitress. Um, she married a little bit after 1900 to a man named Burkhart and was briefly very happy until she found out that he was a bigamist and already had a wife. And so that was the end of that. She kind of drops from the historic record for about 10 years and then crops up again in Canada, where she marries a man named Jack Alexander. And the two of them moved to Issaquah to make a life together. So Jack was the town blacksmith, and he was very quiet and retiring, did not have a lot to say. Stella, aside from the story I'm about to tell you, she was known for having healing skills, particularly with dogs. I knew a gentleman who said he took his 2 hunting dogs to see her because they were sick and she was able to help them out. She was involved in a lot of local organizations, including the Red Cross and the Republican Women's Club. And in 1927, she decided to get into local politics. And she was the first woman elected to the town council in 1927. And then in 1932, she was elected as mayor on a platform of fiscal conservatism. So of course, the Depression had started. This is 1932. And one of the things that had happened in politics in the year before is that the town council had decided to levy a tax on businessmen so that they could pour sidewalks. There were not concrete sidewalks yet. They just had plank sidewalks. So Stella May said that if you voted for her, you wouldn't have to pay your sidewalk tax. Well, that sounded like a good deal to everybody, and so she was elected. So she was the first woman mayor, and the trouble started almost immediately as soon as she got into office. So one of the first hints was that the press never failed to refer to her as the woman mayor, the female mayor, or the petticoat mayor. So that's demoralizing right off the bat. You don't just get to be the mayor, you have to be the woman mayor or the petticoat mayor. The fire chief, Remo Castagno, made an ominous pronouncement. He said, "No woman is going to run this town." And at the first council meeting, 3 council members actually refused to be seated at the table with her. And when a reporter asked them later, well, what did you think was going to happen? I mean, you knew she got elected, right? And they said, well, we never thought she'd make it into office. So Stella Alexander got mad, and she decided to appoint new council members to take the place of the 3 who refused to take their seat. So 2 of them kind of acceded to that, and the third one claimed that he was going to take his seat until somebody else was appointed. So Alexander asked the marshal to remove him, and the marshal said, you know, he hasn't broken any laws. And Alexander proceeded to fire the town marshal. So now she's fired 3 councilmen and a town marshal. At the next meeting, we have 2 sets of councilmen show up, those that were elected and those that were appointed. And the mayor made a motion to exclude the elected group. And when no one seconded her motion, she picked up an oak chair and brandished it at the most objectionable councilman as if to throw it. So that's a direct quote. That story has turned into, yeah, she threw chairs. She didn't. She just threatened to throw a chair. So that's a fine distinction, but one that I feel the need to make. So in looking at this clipping from the Issaquah Press, notice of reward. A reward of $10 will be paid to anyone giving information leading to the arrest and conviction of any person or persons who willfully and deliberately destroyed property at the home of Mrs. S.M. Alexander on the night of October 31st. So I'm going to go over to the chat real quick, and I'm curious, what do you think? Well, first of all, what's October 31st? And do you have a guess?
So October 31st. Oh, because that's when the event took place.
Okay, we're getting Halloween. Yes. So what do we think happened on Halloween to her property? What property do you think was damaged on Halloween? Close. Something that would be even more inconvenient. And you'd note the privy. Yes. Thank you, Diana Hall. Yes. So And I know that because one of the perpetrators confessed it to me in the early 2000s. So yes, they tipped over her outhouse, and she was so mad that she paid to put a notice in the paper to find out who it was. But I have kept the secret, and I will continue to. Um, so to continue Stella's story, so she also had a conflict with the fire department. Not to, I mean, so council, town marshal, now we've got the fire department. So one of the volunteer fire department was a very macho group, and they were very proud of the fact that they were going to fight fires anywhere in the Issaquah area that those fires occurred. And that was great, except that the town's insurance agent had said to the mayor, Stella Alexander, you really can't have them fighting fires outside the city limits, because if a fire happens inside the city limits while they are outside the city limits, your insurance will not pay for any of the buildings that are burned down. So this seemed like a pretty good argument to Stella to have the firemen stay inside of town. Well, the fire department had already received permission from the town council to fight out of town fires, and they said that that they were done. They were going to quit. So they said the mayor would have to go fight her own fires. So now she's out a fire department. So clearly the people of Issaquah were not too thrilled with her, and she was not too thrilled with them. And it took 3 attempts before they were able to vote her out of office. But she did finally get repealed in 1934. This is a diary entry from a woman we'll talk about in a little bit, 1934, and it's hard to read, and I would love to know what she wrote down first and then rewrote over that, because I have a feeling it's juicy. But Minnie Wilson Schomburg wrote, "Repeal election filed, Stella recalled 208 to 83, tickled pink." Now, this was a major editorial for Minnie Wilson Schomburg, who usually just made notes like the one at the bottom where it says stormy. Usually she was about the weather, the business, where she went that day, whether or not her husband was sick. But she was pretty happy about Stella being out of office, and that's because she was the town clerk that Stella fired. So Stella Alexander ran for a couple other offices after she was recalled, and did not make any of them. One of the posts she ran for was Secretary of State. And she ended up moving to Renton, where she and her husband operated a hotel there. So I really feel for Stella Alexander, because I think that if she had been a man, a brash, strong, big man, instead of a brash, strong, big woman, she probably would have had a much easier time of it, and people would have accepted things like chair brandishing and firing from her. So I think that she was a little bit ahead of her time, and I definitely would have loved to have coffee with her as well. So, so this one, we're going to buckle in a little bit. This one is international, so we're going to learn a few things about global politics that we maybe didn't know. I definitely didn't know before I tripped over this story. So Anita Huavar was the daughter of Finnish immigrants. There were quite a few Finnish immigrants to Issaquah back in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So she was a 1939 graduate at Issaquah High School, and her nickname was Sunny because of her pleasant disposition and probably because of her blonde hair. She finished school here in Issaquah and then went on to the University of Washington, where she got a teaching degree, came back home, taught in Issaquah between 1944 and 1949, and then she took a job in Yokohama, Japan, and she was working at an international school and actually became the principal there. And while she was in Japan, she met a man named Kevin Carroll, and they fell in love and they got married. And so he worked for USAID, U.S. Agency for International Development, which was something of a different organization then than it is today, but same general idea. And he was sent to the Balochistan region in Iran. Now, I bet you did not think you would be learning about the Balochistan region of Iran during a presentation about women of Issaquah. It is a bit of a surprise. So here's a map of Iran. We're going to do an accelerated briefing on Iranian politics in the mid-20th century. If you look down to the lower Right, you can see there's a region called Sistan va Balochistan. That is Balochistan. That's the area that we're talking about. It's in southeastern Iran. You can see it kind of butts up against Pakistan and Afghanistan, which of course, I could be wrong, but I don't believe were countries at the time we're talking about. But that gets into subcontinental history, which I don't claim to be a pro at. So, politics of Iran. In 1951, a man named Mohammad Mossadegh was elected as the 35th prime minister of Iran. So he was elected, part of the government. In 1953, the Shah of Iran came to power after a coup against Mossadegh. So this coup was supported by the United States government and the British government, and this is all documented. It wasn't public knowledge at the time, of course, but it has since been made public. Why did they support the coup? Well, Mossadegh was planning to nationalize the oil industry in Iran, which would make oil more expensive, they feared. So Balochistan had been a semi-independent state before the Shah took over, and the folks who lived there were ethnically Balakis. So they weren't Persian, they weren't Farsi, they spoke their own language, the Balaki language, they had their own type of clothing, and they had their own culture, and they had been allowed to continue practicing that culture over the years under Mossadegh. The Shah came in and he made the government, he made Persian the national language and promoted Persian culture and began trying to forcibly assimilate the Balakis by limiting their education, outlawing their language, and banishing their traditional attire. So, and we've seen that sort of cultural erasure happen in other places in the world and in our own country, in fact. So, meanwhile, in the United States, very few people were aware of these nuances in the history of Iran, or indeed even of the Middle East. In the 1950s, your average American thought about the Middle East as a place where he'd seen a lot of movies, seen cartoons maybe, seen things that kind of presented this vision of harems, camels, belly dancers, sand, oases. That was kind of it. That was just sort of this vague hodgepodge in folks' mind, unless they were, you know, for whatever reason, much more highly educated about Iran. So on March 24th, 1957, the Carrolls, Anita and her husband, and another American named Brewster Wilson were en route to a city on the, and I'm trying to see if I can see it so I can point it out to you. It's the city at the very bottom. It's called Shahabar. So that's a port city, so it's on the Gulf of Oman. They were on their way to this particular city when Balaki resistance fighters opened fire on them. So these were people who were fighting against the Shah. They were resisting the current government in Iran. So Kevin Carroll and Brewster Wilson were killed immediately, along with an Iranian driver and interpreter that was with them, and their bodies were left at the scene. Anita Hoover Carroll was taken from the scene. She was not there. They didn't know what had happened to her. So government officials suggested that she had been kidnapped by a band of nomads who intended to sell her to the slave trade once they reached the Arabian Peninsula. So this sounds like something out of a movie or a bad Gothic romance novel. And I think that this was a fabricated plot to kind of play into the interests and the audience of Americans, because the government didn't really want to shine a lot of light on what was actually happening politically in Iran. So the officials also stated that the nomads probably did not know that their intended victims were American. So contemporary sources suggest that that Brewster and Carroll may have been in Shahabar because they were evaluating it as a potential future military base. Again, there's a lot of mixed information, and I haven't had a chance to write away for the CIA files yet, but that's one of the things on my list of things to do to get a little more clarity on what happened. But what happened is in the interim, where they don't know where Anita is, all of these newspaper stories start coming out. And you see some of the headlines here. Bandit will release Anita. Bits of paper clue to stolen U.S. wife. So there was a story that people had found pieces of paper leading a trail into the desert, and they thought, oh, well, that must be Anita trying to be found. Again, the idea of their fear that she's going to be sold into slavery. A lot of the articles mention how pretty she was, too. She was very beautiful, and she was very blonde. And so there was a lot of suggestions that she was someone who would be exotic in a Middle Eastern slave market. So that plays a lot into the notion of Orientalism, which is sort of the flattening of Middle Eastern cultures and kind of turning them into a caricature of themselves. So there was a little bit of that happening. Here's another article, and there's a quote from it. For years, a bandit chieftain named Dad Shah has ruled supreme on the harsh and inhospitable Tanjur K Desert in southeastern Iran, looting, pillaging, murdering, and conducting a brisk trade in girls in the slave markets of the Persian Gulf. So Dad Shah was actually a historic figure. He was a tribal leader of a group of Balakis. So he was another one of these resistant fighters. So, of course, the newspapers painted him as a bandit rather than a political figure. And Dad Shah was actually killed in a gunfight not too long after this whole incident occurred. So this was March 31st that they were still talking about looking for her body. And then finally the news came out that her body had been found 10 miles from where her husband had been killed. She had not been kidnapped. There had not been any big journey across the desert there had been no shredded pieces of paper. So this whole story that the US papers had been spinning kind of came to a grinding halt for all the folks that had been eating all of this up. And of course, back in Issaquah, Anita's parents and brother were still living in this small town, along with people who had known her growing up, students who had learned from her, and people who cared about her. So it was this strange, kind of stilted international story for everybody else. But for the people in Issaquah, it was really a tragic event and a loss of one of the people in their community. So, and the editor of the press wrote in this issue that came out April 4th, 1957, the heartfelt sympathy of the community is with Mr. and Mrs. John Huavar in their great sorrow. Their attractive daughter, still with the attractive, even after she's died, that we've got to talk about how attractive she is. I find that interesting. And sister was born and raised here. Hundreds of residents were her schoolmates or were students under her. All who knew her had the greatest admiration for her many qualities. Her memory will long remain, and there can be no doubt that the world is a better place because of her. Certainly her life was devoted to the welfare of others. And that is the sad story of Anita Huavar. I used to end the presentation here, and that proved quickly to be a bad idea because it's a sad story and not a great ending place. So we've got two other women we're going to talk about. This next story is a story of an average 16-year-old in Issaquah. And while I was researching and writing about her, I thought it was interesting to look at some of the reasons why a 16-year-old girl might make it into the newspaper in 1908. And so some of the examples you'll see are listed, things like leading a discussion topic at church, attending a Baptist convention, being the secretary of the club that's raising funds for new windows at church, perfect attendance, giving a reading of children's poetry. It all sounds very wholesome and very earnest and very lovely. And we're going to talk a little bit about Mary Cranick, who made a splash in the papers in a different way. So her first inclusion in the paper was on the occasion of her father's death. So this happened in February or so of 1908. Her father, George Cranick, who was a coal miner, was coming home from a piece of property he'd purchased and stopped off at the home of George Bennett. George Bennett and his friend Joe Pete were drunk, and George Cranick was shot. George Bennett claimed that it was self-defense, but since Cranick did not have a gun or any other kind of weapon, that seems unlikely. And so George Cranick left behind him a wife and a family of children. And two of those children, Mary and her older brother, were among those who traveled to Seattle by train to testify at the trial against George Bennett. So if you can imagine being 16 and not only has your father been murdered, but now you're going to go to Seattle and you're going to be part of the trial. So about 2 months after that, and I'm not a trained social worker, but if I were, I would make some theories. But about 2 months after her father's death, we find this notice in the newspaper. Mary Cranick and her friend Lily Hosko were arrested yesterday and charged with petty larceny by J.S. McNamee and given a hearing in Judge Gus's court in the afternoon. After examining the girls and 3 witnesses, search warrants were issued and a quantity of the missing property was found at their homes. So the accused were taken to Seattle last night by Marshall Case and will appear today before the juvenile court. So juvenile court was a new idea at this time period. Not too long prior to 1908, if you committed something qualified as a crime, you would go to regular grown-up court. But they had just started instituting this juvenile court and started kind of creating a pathway for juvenile justice at this time period. So I don't know a whole lot about Lily Hosko. I know that she had a lot in common with Mary Cranick. Both of their parents immigrated from Austro-Hungary. Both of their fathers were coal miners. Actually, Lily Hosko's dad was one of the pallbearers at George Cranick's funeral. And we know that they were probably both Catholic, and they both lived in roughly the same area of town. So the girls were taken to Seattle, and their case was dismissed by Judge Frater. He slapped them on the wrist and told them to go forth and behave themselves, and they did not. So we have this next article. This came out in the Issaquah Press the next week. Girls are in more trouble. The girls who were sent from here Thursday to appear before juvenile court were dismissed. They returned, and so Lily returned Monday evening, and Mary arrived home late, having left the train at Bush's Siding and loitered in the valley. Well, no good can come of loitering. So apparently they were at it again, stealing clothing items from the Pickering residence. And so they got taken back to the Seattle court to face Judge Frater in juvenile court again. So he was not quite so lenient this time. Obviously, they had not gone forth and been good. They had immediately committed another crime as soon as they got home. And so both of them were sent to different places. Mary Cranick was sent to the home of the Good Shepherd, and Lily Hosko was sent to the Washington State Training School. So both of these places, the idea was that they were going to rehabilitate these penitent girls. So the idea at the Good Shepherd Center was much more that they would rehabilitate them than they were being punished. They actually made an effort to give the girls skills that they would need when they got out of school. So some of the things they studied were character education, voice, piano, needlework, dressmaking, public expression, vocational training, and physical education. So very well-rounded. And half of the Good Shepherd orphanage was actually orphans, and the other half were girls from good homes who were being educated. So there was quite a mix of different folks in the orphanage. So shortly after Mary graduated from the Good Shepherd Center, after about 2 years, she married a fellow named Elmer Cox. So Elmer grew up in the University District, which is close to the Good Shepherd Center, and his family operated a dry cleaning business. So the Good Shepherd Center had a big laundry that serviced the local railroads. So I'm tending to think that they met in some way because of laundering or cleaning things, but I haven't finished dialing that in. So even though her first foray into being in the newspaper was not innocuous and was probably something that later was a little embarrassing to her, she went on to get married. She and her husband moved to California, and they opened a sweet shop and had 2 kids. And she came home occasionally to Issaquah to visit her mother. So things turned out okay for her. She did just as well for herself as the Bessie Cubbins and the other gals that we started out with there in the beginning. So we have one more lady to talk about, and then we'll get to questions. So Minnie Wilson Schomburg had a really fascinating lifespan. So she grew up in an era when there were coal miners walking the streets in Issaquah. Her grandmother operated a hotel, which a lot of coal miners would have stayed in, would have enjoyed beers in. She lived across the street from the depot, which was operating and taking passengers during the time she was growing up. She lived to see men land on the moon after growing up in a horse and buggy time period. And she lived to see the mines closed down and grown over. She lived to see the depot fall into disrepair. And she lived to see it reconstructed again by a group of volunteers. So the picture on the right is Minnie with a dog. Minnie loved dogs from early in her life and always had them. And the picture at the right is a campfire troop. Minnie was responsible for forming the first Campfire Girls group in Issaquah, and she was their leader for some years. And so she was important to the campfire group. So we know a ton about Minnie, in part because several Historical Society volunteers did oral histories with her when she was still living. And a large number of her papers, diaries, letters, photographs came to the Issaquah History Museums after her death. And among these were daily journals. So Minnie was the one who was tickled pink when Stella Alexander was fired. Um, in most of these journals, she made just kind of brief notes about where she was on that particular day, what kind of work she did, what kind of projects she did at home, that kind of thing. But the real treasure are the letters that she wrote to her fiance during World War I when he was away at training, and then later in France fighting in the war. And there's a snippet here from one of her letters. Dear Jake, here it is only one day since I saw you, and it seems a year. I woke up at 5 this morning and laid and thought about you. And so there's lots of loving language. There are some suggestions that maybe when he's not training, he could spend a little more time writing to her. Lots of discussions about maybe they should have gotten married before he left for the service. And then lots of updates on the goings-ons in Issaquah, who's getting married to who's getting in trouble for running moonshine, and who's been called up and who's going to the service. So the pictures here, this picture on the right of them in their getting up and going out clothes, it says the days of real sport down at the bottom. This was the picture that Jake carried with him when he went to World War I. And then the picture on the left, this is a picture of them in their later married life. They did a lot of hunting, fishing, hiking, camping together, very outdoorsy. I think about they're sort of the ultimate Issaquah romance. One of her letters, she wrote to him and said, "Oh, Jake, I saw the best axe head in the window over at the hardware store, and as soon as I save up enough money, I'm going to buy it for you." In another letter, she says to him, "Jake, I don't know who I miss more, you or my fishing pole, because I haven't been fishing since you've left." And so their romance was definitely tied up a lot in these outdoor sports that they both enjoyed together. So I mentioned she was the town clerk at one point in time. They never had kids, even though they wanted them. And she was described by locals as a modern woman, a sharp business lady, and someone with a great memory. And we have a lot to be grateful to her for at the Historical Society, because she spent a lot of time helping volunteers figure out what Issaquah was like. So, and then at this point, I would love your feedback on, this is a shot of her diary. I'm rushing ahead of myself a little bit. Who else should I be talking about when I do this presentation? I haven't updated it in a while. Here are a few names of women I've thought of that I think it would be great to include. And if you have any other suggestions, throw them up in the Q&A or the chat, and I will take note of them.